Hello, everyone. We're back, and we're not sick anymore for the most part. Welcome to the Beauty in Between podcast, which I almost forgot the name of because I'm recovering from being sick. I'm Katie, and this is my husband, Gabe. Say hello to the people.
Hello, people.
And everybody. Well, before we just jump into our really fun topic today, how are you, honey bunny?
I'm doing all right. Like we said, recovering from sickness. Still feels like there's a little bit of brain fog and stuff. And allergies have been hitting us a little bit too, but we're finally back into a steady place where we can actually do things and feel good with them. So I'm glad to have that going in our favor. And then this week, I just stopped with my job that I was doing previously, and so this week has kind of been just unemployed week and kind of get done what I want to get done. So it's been interesting because I haven't really had like a whole lot of time or space like that. But I'm just trying to do as many things as I can, and also watching the Olympics is fun. So glad to have this specific week off. If anything,
I'm so glad to hear you say that watching the Olympics has been fun
yeah.
because I've been low key scheduling my meetings and my days around Olympic live events.
Well, how have you been this week, Katie? What kind of things do you bring to the table this week?
Yeah, well, for context for everybody, if you've been chugging along with us, you will recall that for our last episode, I think I was commenting on how I had just been sick or had really severe allergies or something, and that I sounded kind of strange. On the exact day that we recorded that episode, apparently that was the day that my body was actually getting over COVID, and was also the same day that my dear husband contracted COVID. Then I was briefly healthy for a few days, and then I just got sick with a secondary infection that I feel like hit me more than COVID did. So as far as this week goes, today is day 2 of feeling like I'm not going to be sick forever. So that's nice. Where I don't know if there are other people out there who experience this, but sometimes when I get sick, if it's for longer than 24 hours or something like that, sometimes I get sick or injured or re injured or whatever. And I so quickly forget what it feels like to actually be fully functioning and to function in a, mostly healthy manner. And then I just think that I'm never going to be healthy again. So, and then at the end of those moments, I always have a moment where I'm like, oh my gosh, this is what it feels like to have energy and to not be in pain and to not have a sinus headache all at the same time. This is crazy. So I'm sort of living on that, but at the same time, my brain is also not fully functioning, and I can tell that it's not fully functioning. It's not as bad as it was a week ago. I can frame and form sentences together, but this will be interesting because I can tell that I have to work really hard to figure out the words that I'm going to say
Yeah.
next. So
So it's great that we're with each other because we can help collectively try to figure out things.
it'll be
Um,
great.
yeah. And then with COVID for me, like I had the experience of a lot of body chills, pretty severe body aches, and it was pretty rough for like the first 3 or 4 days. And then the rest of it was just kind of like congestion, fatigue, and those sorts of things were all in there. Um, but yeah, glad to be kind of in the clear for that and getting back to being functional people.
Yes, it's nice.
So yeah, with today, we're going to be diving into the topic of divorce. Kenny has a bit of a background with that, or just kind of experiences, and I think it'd be really great to look at it from different perspectives than what it's necessarily traditionally talked about, and even looking at her specific experience. Um, yeah, which isn't often or always there's kind of the question of like, is divorce a sin? So yeah, we're just gonna be talking about divorce from a little bit of a different perspective, and yeah, we'll see where things go.
Yeah.
But Katie, just wanted to say, or just wanted to ask, kind of like with your experience and your story, going through 2 different divorces, just wanted
Hmm.
to, give you some space to kind of talk about your backgrounds and your kind of experiences before diving into, a couple of questions that I and maybe some other people have regarding divorce.
Yeah. definitely. And it's probably good to start right off the bat with the reason that I really wanted to talk about divorce was not because I am contemplating divorcing you, Gabe,
Thank you.
or because I've married someone and have become divorced or divorced them or whatever. Am, I was, we'll go with past tense. I was a child of two divorces over the course of my developmental years. My biological parents, which I talked about a little bit, I think in the first episode. The first divorce that I experienced was when I was 4 years old and my sister was two. And my mom and my dad, they had been married for, I think, almost to the day when it was legalized or finalized. They had been married for 10 years. They actually were high school sweethearts, which is like, we'll have to get into the more story aspect of this in some other episode. But needless to say, there were a lot of pain points in, well, unsurprisingly, in the marriage itself, but also throughout the time of going through the divorce. That was pretty rough. I won't go into their story for them, but as the child experiencing it, I remember that my interpretation of divorce number one was that it was pretty turbulent, pretty violent, not necessarily physically, like towards me, like I didn't receive physical violence in that time, but it just all, there was a lot of very strong, visceral, like anger and pain and some manipulation and lying and a lot of hurt everywhere. And as a child, just trying to figure out what was going on, and the court system in Texas, because this was in the year 1999, um, the court system was still very much under the influence and direction that it's best, no matter what, for the child to have their biological father specifically in their lives. So even though there were some complicated, hard things that surrounded every single time we did that, we did the whole the divorce decree had us going over to his house every other weekend, and there was a point where he lived close enough that we went over to his house on Wednesday nights as well, and the entire month of July, and we flipped holidays. So that sort of, and that went on until I was in 7th or 8th grade, and then we basically had a whole other moment where my sister and I decided that we didn't want to deal with the turbulence and the pain of we'll just call it, of the chaos that was going on, both whenever we would go over there and the sort of differentials between being with our dad and being with our mom, and just hearing the stories and sort of varied shared stories of like, what is reality and who are we and what should we do and what's right and what's wrong and who's in the right and who's in the wrong and all that stuff basically resulted in us not seeing our dad for 3 or 4 years, and then he kind of popped up again, and then we didn't see him for 10 years, and now my sister and I are hanging out with him again. So that's the story all attached to the first divorce. The second divorce that I went through as a child was my mom remarried when I was 8 or 9, something like that, and they were married for 7-ish years, something like that. And what I remember experiencing in the second divorce, or how I interpreted things, because I think I was 18, 17, wait, 18, 7. I was 15 or 16 during the second divorce. So I was, by this point, I had taken on the mantle of protector of my little sister, sort of protector of me, but I sort of had to grow up pretty fast, and I just like kept an eye on a lot more than I think my sister grew up needing to take on. So I interpreted the events of the second divorce as being almost the exact opposite, whereas I feel like the first divorce was an explosion. I actually remember describing it this way: the second divorce felt like an implosion. My ex stepdad, he I have not had contact with him since then. I have no idea where he is as of today. But I remember that he had a Catholic background where divorce was even more stigmatized than in some other cultures and backgrounds. And apparently, my mom learned this after marrying him, that he had actually experienced a divorce before they got together. And then he married my mom, and then my mom was divorcing him. So he was like, oh, no, 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 I can't experience another divorce because that would just be really bad. Why? We're not sure. Just, the image of it would just be really bad. So he literally went to a motel and hid at the motel for I think a couple weeks under a fake name, and the person who was sent to hunt him down to serve him the divorce papers literally had to hunt him down and find him. And I remember them telling my mom, and then my mom told us why it had taken so long for him to be served, because he
It's
was
like a bounty hunter for
literally running
divorces.
away. Yes, it's a real thing. I don't remember like the job title of who does that. I don't know if it's like law or judge clerks or whatever, but some of these people genuinely have to track down the people that they're serving. It was cartoonish. And then he just sort of, I also think this happened around my birthday. The beginning of the end anyway, officially speaking. That I remember he just basically dropped off the map. I don't know where he was staying between the time of like starting the divorce process and then actually finalizing the divorce. But I do remember that he withdrew all of the money from my mom's and his shared bank accounts. So we technically had access to $0 as far as not just lines of credit, but like actual access to funds sitting in a bank. We didn't have anything. But my mom was actually prepared for this, and she had set aside a couple, like however much in cash in her shoes in her closet because she was expecting him to do that.
Yeah.
So those are sort of the brief descriptions of the sort of divorces that I've gone through. And one more little thing that I think is interesting is that I briefly mentioned some of this in our first episode, and my mom listens to our podcast, which is fun. And she called me at some point and said that it was so interesting that I refer to the sort of major life events as far as her marriages go. I refer to the divorces and having been through 2 divorces, but she uses the language of, she had 2 marriages that ended in divorce, but primarily we'll use the language of referring to the time of marriage, which I think is so interesting. So even just
Mhm.
the different perspective of me as a child having gone through the divorces, I feel like I haven't really heard a lot of people talk about experiencing divorce as a kid a lot. So
Yeah.
those are my experiences.
And yeah, had a couple questions I wanted to go through of kind of like diving a little more into your story and how you experienced it. Because you kind of mentioned some of these words of like turmoil and I guess like violence, especially in that first marriage or the
Mm-hmm.
first divorce. If you could kind of like label each divorce with like 1 or 2 words, what do you think those words would be for each one?
Oh yeah, the first one I would label as explosion, and the second one I would label as implosion.
Interesting. Yeah, I heard like a lot of, I guess, like confusion with the court system stuff. And like, I know with your story too, like just a lot of confusion for you and your sister. Like, why do we have to do this or
Mm-hmm.
be in this environment? And I guess also like a lot of pain from like the violence resulting in pain in different ways. Yeah. And then with the first divorce, I guess with that one, how did it feel whenever your mom kind of like finally finalized, at least like putting the papers in to get the process moving forward?
So I don't really remember the legal side
Mhm.
of the first divorce happening. I don't really remember it at all. I mean, especially now, I have memories of when my parents were still married and I interacted with mommy and daddy in my childhood house, and I had memories with both of them in there. And then I just have memories of after the divorce, um and like being driven over to where my dad lived and having to go through the different visitations and things. So,
Mhm.
because I do remember a lot from even starting from age 2, but I don't remember that part.
Yeah.
But I will say something I do remember that was specific to that time was that one, my mom was great. She very much swam upstream in this way that she made sure to put me, I don't remember if she did this for my sister, which would be fair because she was so young, but I remember that she put me in like child play talk therapy or whatever to help
Mhm.
me work through um the pain and sadness and all the hurt feelings and things in around the divorce, because again, I don't have specific memories, but I'm pretty sure at least some like my younger years probably involved some anger that I'm sure my mom was like, that's not healthy or helpful. So let's go to a professional. So she put me with a professional, which I remember. And I remember interpreting those sessions as I really liked the child therapist person that
Mhm.
we went to. And I also liked that I just had free reign of the whole playroom basically, because there was
Yeah.
paint and there were toys and there were things that I could build or whatever. So I remember that was a thing. And then I also remember being in and out of therapy pretty much throughout elementary, junior high, and high school. Um, that was all part of it. And a conversation thread that I recall coming up in therapy, I think, because they were probably sensitive to it. And then I also remember my mom reinforcing the idea um was that there were a lot of questions around like, do I feel responsible for the divorce, and also conversation around, I shouldn't feel responsible for the divorce and that it's not my fault, and do I know that it's not my fault, and all this stuff. But my mom did such a good job of framing um at least post divorce, because I don't remember a ton when it was happening, but over the course of the next couple of years, my mom did a really good job of making it very clear that the divorce was a her and my dad thing and
Yeah.
decision, and that it had nothing to do with us, and that if
Mhm.
nothing else, both of our parents really loved us. The ways and how that looked like and whatnot, and the relationships with each of them individually looked different, but my mom did a really good job of being really consistent about checking in with me and making sure that I didn't feel like it was my fault. And I think my sister would probably say the same thing, that neither of us experienced carrying extreme weight or guilt for the divorce itself, which is something that is relatively, especially at young ages, pretty common when it comes to children experiencing divorce.
Mhm. And then in being in the middle of that too, as the older sister, um, how did you, or did you feel like there were any new responsibilities or roles that you had to kind of fill in, or even if you didn't necessarily feel like you had to, things that you kind of became because of the divorces that were happening, or like in the middle of that?
Totally. Within, I mean, definitely within the first one, and then I think I just played the role in the second one too, but it was just different. Was that I know I took this on explicitly and cognizantly. Like I knew what I was doing when I took on the role of protector. Just because again, there's so much there was just a lot that that was attached to mine and my sister's relationship with our dad, especially at that time. And that the thing about the reason protector became such a big deal was that one, there was a genuine concern of like just being aware that nothing bad was going to happen physically speaking, but also um like every other weekend and for the entire month of July and flipped holidays, it was just me and my sister going over to our dad's. Like there wasn't our mom to help
Mhm.
calm any anger that might happen or anything, because when I was really little, um my dad's anger would just be kind of scary sometimes.
Yeah.
And I remember interpreting that and being like, okay, I have to pay attention to this. I have to redirect it if need be. I need to be the one that sort of like diverts the energy so that my sister didn't have to deal with it. So that that was an experience that shaped me. I mean, it was like multiple experiences over and over and over again from a very young age. But then I kind of just took that and applied it to basically all areas of my life as far as the role that I would play in friendships and different people that I would meet or whatever. Like I really wanted to, with, especially as a child, this was like unfiltered as a child. I really wanted to use every iota and bit of my being to make sure that nobody around me experienced the same degree of hurt and pain that I experienced.
Mhm.
And that came out in a lot of different ways. But I mean, that was something that definitely shaped me from a young age and is also a very Enneagram 8 thing as well.
Yeah.
So there's that.
Yeah, and I know it's probably difficult during that time too. So it was like hard to have the language to express how you were feeling in the midst of things,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of having to learn that language at an earlier age. And yeah, kind of wanted to talk about your mom too. I know, like you said, listens to the podcast, so I got to watch my words a little bit. But love you, Mama Win. Um, but I kind of wanted to ask you too about with your relationship with your mom. What are kind of some different things that you saw or kind of like found out about your mom in the midst of that divorce? Whether it's like different characteristics, tendencies, or roles, or things that were reassuring, like things that you saw
Mm-hmm.
within her in the midst of that.
So I think the only way that I can answer this is through sharing something that I've processed with you a little bit before, but also something that I've processed a lot in the last few years of therapy as an adult. As an adult who's not experiencing mass turbulence or chaos, therapy looks really different. It's so interesting, but still
Hmm.
useful. That I sort of have come to this settling point of using the language that I think growing up, so especially from age 4 to 18, when I was living, at home, that I love my mom, and I'll speak of the past. I love my mom currently, but like growing up, I loved my mom. I a lot of my friends would always comment. I remember especially in high school that they would be like, "Oh my gosh, you have such a great relationship with your mom. You both seem really similar." Of like they'll be like, "Oh man, I see where you get your energy from."
Hmm.
And things like that. And I remember sometimes I would answer the phone to talk to my mom in like driving the car with my friends or something, and we would just have a brief little like, okay, this is what I'm doing, this is what I need to do, this is what's going on, okay, cool, love you, bye. And my friends would be like, wow, you're so open with your mom and you just like tell her stuff. And I was like, yeah. And I think part of that foundation of the relationship with my mom came
Yeah.
from a sort of necessity of sorts. Because growing up, the language that I arrived at is that I think I viewed my mom in a whole bunch of different ways, but one primary way, especially from the home front sort of view, was that I viewed my mom as a co fighter or co warrior of sorts.
Yeah.
But like fighting the same war, sort of. But the war front that I was fighting was the one that was like boots on the ground, got to keep me and my sister safe and good and healthy and happy and all that stuff whenever we're actually with our dad, as opposed to what she would have to deal with was some of his larger, um I don't know, just like bigger sort of attacks of sorts that would be more directed at her, obviously, or sometimes would involve us, but it was still directed at her, basically. Or just obviously a lot of the more legal conversations was all the battlefront of sorts that my sister and I, were not directly involved in. It was more just like my mom would deal with it, and then we would get updates as to what was going on whenever things popped up. So, in a lot of ways, what that meant was that at some point in time, I sort of interpreted it in my own mind. So I interpreted two things actually. One is that in conjunction with the decision that I think I was like, I may have been 6 or 7, maybe it was 8, I don't know. At some point, very young, I just decided that I wasn't going to cry ever, like
Yeah.
in front of people, privately. I just wasn't going to cry because crying was weakness and weakness was bad, was basically like what was going on in my mind. And I also interpreted emotions as weakness, and weakness is bad. And weakness and vulnerability can lead to hurt and pain. So obviously, the way to confront that is to just not feel or show emotion. What was essentially how I chose to approach emotions and feelings and things when I was a child. Um, because, and that wasn't just out of nowhere, I experienced my emotions being weaponized and used against me as a child. So, I mean, there was sort of like some form of relation there. I wasn't just a sad child that decided that emotions were evil out of nowhere. I sort of had some experience with that. But because of that, I also sort of, in my mind, came to the conclusion that if my mom showed any weakness, that was a vulnerability to me, i.e., my mom cannot be weak. Like, I remember, and she and I have talked about this, so it's all good.
Mhm.
But Forrest Gump. I think it was Forrest Gump. I was watching Forrest Gump one time at, I don't know, at some point as a child, like teenager. And, the end of that movie is like sad. And it was really sad. And for all I know, it may have been the first time I watched it, but I remember I was watching it in the living room with, I think I was in the living room. My sister may have been hanging out, and my mom was in the kitchen, and then who knows where my ex stepdad was. So my mom was like kind of watching it too, like typical parent, like doing probably taking care of dinner and dishes, useful things, and I was just being a lump on the couch. But when it got to the end of the movie, it was sad. And I remember turning around and seeing that my mom was standing in the kitchen. It makes me sad thinking about it now. Um, she was standing in the kitchen and she was like tearing up and crying. And I did not know how to respond to that. Like, I was sad that she was sad. I didn't want her to be sad, but I didn't I remember in my head, I was trying to process like what do I do? And all I could do was just look at her because I was like, I don't know. I don't know what to do because this is like, especially at the time I would say, it was negative emotion. So like sad, potentially vulnerable type
Mhm.
emotion. And I was like, I have no idea. I don't know what to do. And what was interesting is that I took on the role of like comforter and supporter to my friends. So it's not that I didn't know how to interact with somebody who's crying because I was a teenager and I was a teenage girl. Like, I knew how to help my friends. But for some reason there was a disconnect between giving support, or even just showing love or presence to my mom, showing
Yeah.
that same emotion, as opposed to whenever like a friend would also be upset or something. And I remember, again, I was like watching this happen. At some point, my sister, who maybe was in the living room, I don't know, at some point, my sister got up and hugged her. And that apparently, because I talked about it with my mom at some point soon thereafter, that was all my mom wanted. She just wanted a hug.
Mhm.
Um, but for some reason, my brain, I just had such a severe disconnect. And then when I watched my sister hug her, I was like, this is weird. So that was, yeah. I, I don't I don't know that the answer is every single nuance that you were looking for in that question, but as far as how I interacted with my mom and even bridging that into now, like, I feel like I don't really have a history of, I wouldn't necessarily keep things from her because to some degree, the line of communication between her and me needed to be open and needed to be honest for the sake of both of us and for like our whole family unit of just like making sure everybody's on the same page and that we all know what's going on. That like open lines of communication was the norm that I leaned into. The thing that I sort of added on to that was that if my mom shows any dangerous I say that in air quotes, people who are not watching this, any dangerous emotions like, being sad or crying, that's just a problem because it's potentially dangerous to me, even though it wasn't necessarily, but that was how I interpreted it.
Yeah. And those probably some of those a little more dangerous once your parents had actually like legally separated and you were going in between households and kind of functioning in a sense where
Not just separated, they were divorced. Legally
yes.
speaking, those are two different things.
Yeah, I meant like separated households wise. But like
Yeah.
whenever you're in that situation where you have to be at one or the other and one isn't a place that you can necessarily just like escape and leave from if you feel unsafe. And
Hmm.
so that like in one place, it's your mom's whenever they were divorced at that point, like probably feeling pretty safe in that environment. But the overall like emotions or severity of what you felt in the unsafe environment with your father kind of trumped your, I guess, like expectations or what you'd experience with your mom, like being solely with her. And so, kind of that protector role that a parent can kind of be in at times, like your
Hmm.
mom was functioning in that role. But when you
Yeah.
were kind of alone, or like with your sister, for instance, at your father's house, like you felt like you had to fill in that role that she was doing.
Hmm.
And so didn't feel fully safe even with her necessarily, or like feeling like you can express those emotions like in this place. And so there wasn't as much of a split between like what you do here and what you do here. It was all kind of combined because of the severity of those feelings, like I said, it
Hmm.
seems.
I was definitely functioning in survival mode. And I
Yeah.
mean that like from a technical standpoint, genuinely, like fight,
Mhm.
flight, freeze, hyper and hypo, stimulated and all that. Like I was in survival mode and mentality, and in some ways scarcity mindset. Part one, up until probably up through college, was all tied, like the survivor mentality of that phase of my life was more tied to like family of origin type things. And then what's interesting is that I shifted from a survival mindset from that time of my life to a slightly different survival mindset by the time that I started working in vocational ministry at the church that I worked at, which that'll be another conversation. But it was interesting because I started diving headfirst into not just ripping off the band-aid, but reopening scars and wounds and digging in deep. Sometime in the latter part of my undergrad years,
Mhm.
I think. In a really explicit, I am doing this. Like I am doing this, we are doing this. I need to like lean in to all the hurt and pain and stuff and stare it all in the face and figure out like how I can grow, how it makes me me, how do I live with all of this because it's really heavy and hard and all this stuff. So it's interesting because I had like survival mentality part one, and then I started leaning in. And then there was survival mentality part two that was more attached to an abusive atmosphere,
Mhm.
vocationally speaking, and then leaning into that. And now I'm in such a healthy and different place. But yeah, so what you're naming is that I was very much in a
Mhm.
survivor and survival mentality for pretty much all of my developmental years.
Yeah. And it's kind of like hard to turn that switch off whenever you're in a different environment. Everything
Hmm.
just kind of gels together a little bit.
Yeah.
And kind of speaking about the different like scars or kind of band-aids you had to rip off, what were kind of some of those lasting effects that you felt even after the divorce, like whenever you had, like more of your own autonomy and weren't forced to be in these situations? What
Hmm.
were those scars of like, whether it's, pain that affected your ability to show emotions or to kind of be vulnerable, or,
Ooh, yeah,
if
yeah,
there's any
yeah.
pain
Okay.
regarding, like fatherhood or marriage or these different things, like how did you feel those lasting effects or what were those?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. So you started asking it, and I was like, I don't know. I didn't feel anything, but I know that that's a lie. Um, Sometime around again the like latter, my junior and senior years of undergrad, I remember it was around that time that I was feeling really convicted again about praying for my dad because he's not a believer. The majority is the majority of the Vietnamese side of my family is like some, Buddhist, atheist, who cares kind of thing. So just not believers. And I kind of grew up praying for him like in different pockets of my life and whatnot. And then at some point in college, I just remember deciding that it was just too hard and it was too painful and it hurt too much. So I kind of just, I didn't give up on him, but I kind of prayed and was like, all right, God, he just assume that I'm praying, even if I'm not. And then I just didn't pray for him. So it's interesting. I kind of started feeling that conviction, and the group of friends that I had at the time, I remember I was working through a lot of this belief that vulnerable or to be vulnerable or vulnerability felt like a dirty word to me at the time. And I
Yeah.
also distinctly remember the Lord really worked this lesson into me and through me and out of me over the course of very specifically my senior year of college. And these friends of mine helped me process a lot of these things. That was very much something that was a remnant of, like, I didn't want to be vulnerable. But the interesting thing is that I have had no trouble growing up, and especially now. But even at that point, I had no trouble going deep and just kind of opening up and being like, here's what's happened in my life, and here are the things. But there was of, um, some degree of vulnerability. I don't even remember what exactly my scale was, so to speak, of like where my line was, because it didn't have anything to do with, which is strange, it didn't have anything to do with intimacy as far as like um what I would share or the degree to which I would share or even the degree to which I would like give myself in a relationship, like friendship relationship, much less dating someone. um but I think it was more vulnerability was attached to trusting people. So something that I kept from a very, very young age up until the Lord really like broke it into smithereens and then had to break it again and a couple more times. Was that at some point as a child, I had decided that I was going to be the most trustworthy person in like all of my friendships and relationships and whoever, that I wanted to be like a dependable person that people could count on, because I didn't have that. There is my mom, who was not able to support me from like in the context where I was. And then my friends, especially growing up, I didn't have like I didn't have understanding from my peers because there was no one else who had experienced a divorce of this sort. And like again, the late 90s and early thousands, it was all like, but he's your dad, so like, why are there any hard feelings? Just go hang out with them. And they didn't understand that there was a lot more going on.
Yeah.
So I did not have someone who could be that for me. So I
Mhm.
decided that I wanted to be that for everybody else. And in that time was also like, well, and in order to protect myself, I will simply trust no one.
Yeah.
Which I think is very Assassin's Creed of me, if I can remember that right. But I loved those games, and I really like the saying that was from that game that I don't even remember anymore. Something along the lines of nothing is true. So basically, just don't trust anyone was what I had taken in. So as I continued to grow up and become a more functioning young adult in the world, and then like adult in the world, um, I think that was it. I was linking vulnerability and trusting people. So I didn't want to trust people with if I was afraid of something, not like snakes or something, but like afraid of something about a decision that I needed to make or
Sure.
my future. Like I didn't want to share those things with my people because I didn't want to be vulnerable, because I didn't want to ultimately trust them, or something that was also like a pattern that, again, these friends of mine specifically kind of called out in me, and I got to work on a lot in that year. Like that
Yeah.
one year was crazy, specifically, that whenever I was sort of experiencing hurt or pain or turbulence or something, like my reaction, instead of leaning into community, would be to run away from it and to go isolate myself, to kind of be like, I need to deal with it by myself because
Uh,
that's what's safe. But then what's funny is that now I do the exact opposite, and I can't tell you how many people I tell now, that's not healthy because God gave us community, which was the main thing working on with me.
Yeah, I think one of the things with that is like for me, I kind of have a similar experience with, or have always had a same similar experience where I'm able to tell things to people and be like, hey, I'm opening up to you about the things that are going on in my life. But it's a completely different thing to actually like get advice from them and to trust them with those things of like, it's much easier to tell or to have somebody tell you, I'm praying for you. You're like, awesome. Yeah. Easy peasy thing. But if somebody starts giving you feedback or advice or like challenges you in different ways, then that's like, oh, that's like a little different because then you're
Uh,
you're not necessarily trusting them with what's going on, but you're trusting them to
sh-
like help you in that sense. And
sure.
it almost becomes like the issue almost seems too big for those people to really like accomplish it with you. And you're like, this is kind of my thing that I have to deal with or figure out.
Sure, but it wasn't the feed like it wasn't because I didn't want their feedback or I didn't want their thoughts or that I didn't want to be challenged. That was actually why I was friends with everybody that I'm friends with even now. I like and did not mind feedback, challenge, etc. It wasn't that. It was that I didn't want to be hurt. And that doesn't come through feedback. It's that if I am open about whatever it is that I'm afraid of or what I'm not trusting you with or what I don't want to share, it wasn't that, oh, I don't want to take in feedback or have a conversation or whatever. It was that this is a potential path to somebody having like a straight line to a deeper part of me that most people don't have that will be abused in one way or the other and is a straight line to me potentially being hurt. So it had nothing to do with that. Although that
Yeah.
would have been more logical, but that was a severely illogical agreement that I had made internally for like a decade.
Yeah. I guess like what I'm saying is, and I'm trying to think of like a good illustration for it, but it's easier to kind of like let people into what's going on rather than kind of like stepping on their shoulders in a sense. Like
Yeah.
it's better for you to be that person that other people can depend on for support and things like that. But
Hmm.
depending on somebody else for that support and things that are vulnerable, like, if somebody is able to help you feel like really great or like, man, I feel much more confident now. And they are kind of the one that breaks that down. Like that's so much worse than somebody who's on the surface and like if they say something doesn't make sense or like you're like they completely don't know what's going on. Like it is what it is. But if you
Hmm.
have somebody who knows you on a certain level, as sense and says something that's like insensitive or something that's like illogical to you, and you're like, where did you even like? I can't just do that.
Hmm.
Then it feels so much harder because you feel like you're known at a certain point. It takes a lot of a bigger toll almost than those people who just know the
Hmm.
surface. So,
Well, and
yeah.
I think the other thing is that the possible impact that whoever that person was, if I did trust them or whatever, they have a greater potential
Yeah,
degree of impact, essentially,
exactly.
of like something. I remember talking about this in therapy when I was like 5, was that I also, in answer to your question like a while ago, I also developed a fear of abandonment.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I which, man, I'm just thinking about little Katie. Like little Katie dealt with so much and it's so sad. But anyway, so there was a fear of abandonment that was also very 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 much mixed into all of this, and I'm sure it's still at play in my psyche now because that doesn't just completely
Mhm.
it doesn't just go away. Although I would say it's more manageable now. But I think the other thing about the when it came to not wanting to be vulnerable and for the sake of not wanting to be hurt, it was also very much tied to I don't want this person to betray me with the information that I'm sharing with them
Mhm.
in one way or the other. Something that was wrapped up in another version of what if they betray me in this way was like, what if I go to this person because there's all because I'm only letting in like one person at a time, if
Mhm.
anyone, and I share everything with them, and then maybe they respond to me or maybe they don't, and then at some point they just abandon me, and then it's like I just exerted all of my emotional, not just energy, but also my like emotional cries for help into one area, and then
Yeah.
that area returned void. So that was also at play. And it's also very interesting thinking about this now, because this is so not how I think about things
Yeah. I think
now.
it's like a really tough feeling to battle with, especially because like everybody has their own things that they're going through too. And some people don't have that mental energy to actually like provide what you're looking for. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, that's a tough thing with like being the person that other people can stand on your shoulders. You're like cool with that. You can be the supporter. But once you have to like stand on somebody else's shoulders, it's a really scary thought. And whenever you allow that, yeah, it's like you're made of glass practically. So it's sad, like, kind of feeling like, hey, I have only allowed a certain amount of people in. And once one of those people like don't actually respond well to it, or like I said, kind of might have been insensitive or something that would have been negative, then it's
Mm-hmm.
like, I guess I've like kind of lost that person from my team in a sense, which is a really painful thing to experience.
Right.
Um, but it's hard because yeah, there's so many things going on, and so for me, even like some of these people are experiencing a crap ton. And they're like, I don't have the room or like space. And then once they leave to like deal with their own stuff, you're like, why did I share all that with you in the first place?
Well, sort of. I think there's
Right.
some divergence
That's more
between
for me,
my
I guess.
interaction
But
with it and yours.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
that
more
end part
for
at least.
you. But yes, I've seen that happen in other people and you. So, yeah.
Well, I guess like half of that is kind of like who we probably are as like supporters of other people. But then the other half is more of my experience.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. Well, I think that's I know we didn't get to the actual question of divorce being a sin, but I think that's a
I've
pretty good
already
place.
changed the title of this in my head.
Yeah.
This was an entirely different conversation
Sorry
than
about
what
that.
we were like supposed to talk about.
But
So
yeah, I think it's really good to talk
hopefully this
about.
is good. I don't even, this isn't what we planned. Recording the day before we release it. So audience, hopefully you enjoy this, because we put no strategic
Yeah.
planning into this one. This is different.
Yeah. I mean, I just kind of started diving into questions for you, and I love interviewing people, or like, not interviewing, but like, getting to know their stories and interact with them. And
Mm-hmm.
so, because I think it's like for the audience, like that could be super helpful for somebody who's in the midst of a divorce or has experienced a divorce, or kind of
Mm-hmm.
like you said, like kind of going through it as a kid. And there are a bunch of different experiences where, people experience actual like physical violence, and a lot of people who experience like emotional violence that has put them into that state where they've had to adapt so many things to kind of build up this defense just in case. And so I think it's really important because um, your story is probably like similar to a lot of people that have experienced pain within divorces, and especially like two divorces. Um,
Two different types on
yeah,
two
two
different
different
ends of the
types
spectrum.
completely. And yeah, so I think it's super great to talk about it for the audience. And I think there will be a lot of people who like get good stuff from it, but
We'll
let us
see,
know.
because I was not planning on sharing all of this. So
Yeah, let us know
vulnerability.
if
See, you're welcome.
yeah. And if y'all, want to talk about some of the topics that we've kind of touched on with like kind of trust and community, or kind of talking about the pain and kind of like walls that we sort of build up, like I think those are great topics too. And I definitely want to go through the divorce being, is it a sin or is it not a sin kind of topic later on. So let us know,
Yeah,
like, which kind of those
we can
conversations
make it
y'all
a
would like
part
tend
two.
towards. Yeah.
There is something that I want to end this on, though, is
Mhm.
not even the question. We normally end with what's the invitation to our listeners,
Yeah.
which we can still do that. But something else that I wanted to touch on, because this was part of what I wanted to touch on that we didn't talk about, is that something that different people have asked me across my life is, if I could go back and change anything, what would I change? And more often than not, I just say nothing, because God has been very clearly at work in all areas and times and everything in my life. So like, why would I change what he's done? That makes no sense. But a lot of the times when I answer it like that, people who do know at least some of my story and know that I've been through at least one, if not two, divorces, some people will ask me why I don't want to go back and, you know, stop the divorce. Or friends of mine who are older than me, and I remember this when I was in college and I was friends I still am, but as a college student, I was friends with a lot of people who were like 10, 12, 14 years older than me who were married, and some of them had kids. And that those friends of mine would be like, so you wouldn't want to change things with your parents to somehow make them not divorce or something? And I was like, absolutely not. And not because what our faith allows us to do is make a distinction between what is good and what is bad, as in not even like I have the moral high ground and you don't, but just what is good for his people and the image bearer and creations like flourishing, and what is harmful to it. That you don't like, I don't look at divorce number 1 or 2 and think to myself like, man, those are really good things that
Yeah.
that happened. Like the divorces were good. Like, no, 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 no. The divorces as the explosion and implosion of sorts. The explosion and implosion explicitly were bad things. That yes, God used for good, to use a Christian platitude, although that is a verse in scripture. But not, it doesn't just stop there. Like it's not just, oh well, he used the divorce for my good and now I'm like, I am who I am, so I'm fine. It's that the fact that God wove into my story not just 1 but 2 divorces, so that when I was a youth pastor and I still care about teenagers and the next generations and all those things, that when a kid walks up to me and is like, my parents are going through a divorce
Yeah.
because they're hurting but they don't know how to talk about it, but they want help with it, and then I tell them that I understand what they mean, and then they're like, they stonewall and are like, no you don't, nobody knows what I'm going through, and then I'm like,
Mhm.
boom, I've been through 2 divorces. 2. How
Beat
many have you
that.
been through? Well, but the thing is that I can use it to say, like, I do understand, because if it's not like divorce number 1 that I went through, then I bet it's like divorce number 2. And more often than not, I'm able to um, empathize with and help walk, like, children and also adult friends of mine who, like, there have been a couple of friends of mine whose parents have gotten divorced as, like, they have been children, but they've been adult children, like in their 20s or something. So I feel like I'm able to walk with a wider range of people from a deeper sense of empathy, but also understanding and genuine wisdom from the Lord. Like everything that I just shared over the last basically hour of this podcast, like thinking about the place where I started mentally and emotionally and all of that to where God has led me, and the different lessons that he's shown me, is continuing to show me, but also the ways that I can now, like, hopefully be a giant, like, blinking arrow sign that points people to God through community and through actually trusting people, and that as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another, that it requires that you have to choose to trust people, and that you can't just sort of dip your toe in a relationship and then be like, we're close now. That's community. Like, no, it's not. So
Yeah.
there's definitely a deeper sense of who I learned more about, a deeper sense of who God is and what relationship with him looks like. Cause we didn't even talk about that. Um, that my mom also did a good job of pointing out to me where God was in the
Uh-huh.
midst of extreme chaos and turbulence and pain. Like, that's why I say that I don't know when I was saved, because I remember putting my faith into action at a very young age and
Sure.
just being like, God is here and God is my dad, and I know that. And I have no problem understanding that God is a really good dad and a really good king and Lord and Savior and prophet and all of that, because I experienced it and like put it to the test for
Yeah.
basically my entire life. So even just because of that, because of the deeper relationship with God that I
Sure.
got, like, I wouldn't want to change those things.
So one question that I wanted to round it out with, as you know who you are now, having gone through all that stuff and feeling like you're getting in a better place. If you were to give, something to younger Katie, what would be a piece of advice, or maybe even just a reminder that you would give to her, and maybe would give to other people that are experiencing similar things or have experienced things in recent times, something like
I think the biggest piece of advice that I would give to little Katie, like littler, like 8, 9, 10, and also other people who either going through this or just have this thought because you can arrive here without going through divorce, is that God created all of you, and that includes your emotions. That emotions are not of the devil, because I also came to that conclusion when I was like 6. So I was like, well, they're definitely dangerous things. God created all of you. That includes your emotions, which means that you can trust Him and yourself, and thus others, with wisdom, with your emotions, because we are emotional beings. We're a lot of things, but our emotions are part of it. And don't be ruled by your emotion, and blah blah blah, all the stuff that the evangelicals would want me to add as a caveat. But like, God created emotion. They are not inherently, intrinsically like bad or sinful or whatever.
Yeah,
So that's the
great.
thing that I would tell both little Katie and other people.
I was hoping you'd say something like that. That's a perfect way to wrap it up, though, I think. You have anything else to say?
Yeah, the only thing else I have to say is leave a comment somewhere and tell us about this episode, because like I said, this is not what we planned. So I'm curious how this will be received. But anyway, that's all we have.
Yeah.
So
Well, also, love if y'all could leave us a review on the different places where you listen to your podcast. And like Katie said, leaving us a comment on how this podcast was for you, or kind of how you felt, maybe what you gated, different things like that. And then also the different things that you'd like to hear about from us. So appreciate y'all.
what's up?
Yeah, hope you have a wonderful week.
Bye, everyone.
See ya.
Peace.